It's almost 3 p.m. Maybe we can get started right at 3 p.m. That would be awesome. There goes notification. That's a good sign. We're still waiting for YouTube. The Church One notification went out before YouTube connected. YouTube has connected, so that should send out a YouTube notification. Do a search for Theology Central. All right, do that. Okay. Church One notification went out before YouTube. All right, turn off the live chat. That's good. All right, we'll give it a couple of seconds here. Oh, let's go over to sermon audio. There we are. Maybe. Good. Test 1, 2, 3. Test 1, 2, 3. All right, we'll give it a couple of seconds here. Oh, okay, we're sound good there. All right, hang on, waiting for the. Oh wait, the website's crashing on me. There we go. All right, the map is not working. Well, that's always disappointing. Okay, well, if you've tuned in, I have no idea that you're listening to me right now because the map of the United States of America shows me that nobody is listening. If I go to Canada, it shows me nobody is listening. If I go to the British Isles, it tells me no one is listening. So no one is listening in the United States, Canada, or the British Isles. That's pretty depressing, okay? Or even internationally, like nobody is listening. So I think that's probably a sign that the map is not working. The reason I know that is I've clicked on the link to the live feed twice, once on YouTube, once on Sermon Audio, and it has not shown up one time. It tells me the analytics are not working. I am going to look at the other broadcasters to see what their analytics look like. Yeah, none of them show any numbers. So Bethel Reformed Baptist Church, I don't even know how long they've been broadcasting, shows none. The prayer meeting has been on for 1 hour and 8 minutes, and it shows nobody is listening. So that tells me that there's something wrong with the analytics, and so that means I can pretty much ignore that because I don't know if anyone is listening or not listening. So I'm going to go with the idea that, let me see, let's just pick a number. 300,000 people have tuned into the Theology Central podcast today. 300,000, okay? And if you believe that, well, send me some money and I will let you own the Brooklyn Bridge. Okay, all right. Now, all right, that would not be accurate, okay? That would be as inaccurate as the number is, okay? So I don't know if anyone's listening. If you are, thank you so very much. Are you ready? Here we go. Without any further delay, we go live in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1.
Looking at our world from a theological perspective, this is the Theology Central podcast, making theology central.
Ladies and gentlemen, I need your help. I'm stuck. I am stuck and I need someone to, I don't know, do you have a chain, something you can pull me out? Because I'm just, you know, when you're stuck and you just keep hitting the accelerator and your tires just spin and spin and spin and you're just making the situation worse. Well, I am stuck and I need someone to pull me out. Who is it going to be? I don't know. If I look at the analytics right now, it tells me nobody is listening. I think that's because the map is not working. So I don't know if there's anyone there to pull me out. You know what? I think I'm going to have to pull myself out, and we're going to have to figure out how to do that. I guess right after I say, good afternoon, everyone. It is Tuesday, January the 6th, 2026. It is currently 3:03 p.m. Central Time. And I'm coming to you live from the Theology Central studio located right here in Abilene, Texas. Now, you may be asking, where are you stuck at? Like, why are you stuck? What's the problem? Well, the problem is I listened to a sermon, and that's where all my problems begin. Every problem in the world can be traced back to listening to a sermon. Okay, that's a little bit of hyperbole, but it all started because I didn't really know what to do. I'm like, okay, well, I know. Let's look on Sermon Audio. Let's go through. Oh, here's an interesting sermon. It's entitled, If You'd Take a Break, You Would Be More Busy. If you would take a break, you would be more busy. I'm like, okay, that's an interesting title. It did its job. It got my attention. Let me look. Oh, this is based on Ruth chapter 2. We've got to review this. So we reviewed it, and it was a hermeneutical train wreck, right? Somehow, Ruth chapter 2, verse 7, where we read these words, and she said, I pray you, let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. So she came and hath continued even from the morning until now, that she tarried a little in the house. And the house, next thing you know, we get all this information about the house that the text never gives us. And the next thing you know, the house somehow was the church, and what we need to do is we go to church and then we get refreshment and all, and we get all these wonderful things supposedly in the church. At some point, we may go back and review the rest of the sermon, but it was just a total and complete train wreck. So the next thing you know, I offer my critique of it, but I had to admit something. That it is true that when you open up the book of Ruth, you find yourself seeing that there's more, that like you're reading the words, but each word has this kind of loaded meaning. And so how do you interpret the book of Ruth? So next thing you know, I'm doing another episode, and then I'm doing another episode. Next thing you know, I'm creating an entire series. Next thing you know, I'm putting together artwork. Next thing you know, I'm coming up with a series description. And it's like, wait, what just happened? And then all of a sudden I realize, wait a minute, I'm stuck. What do I do? Like Ruth chapter 1, I understand, but what do we do with Ruth chapter 2? And do I even continue? Do I go to Ruth chapter 3? Do I go to Ruth chapter 4? I never envisioned that I would start 2026 by covering the book of Ruth, because I need to be doing other things. I need to get to Isaiah 45. I did a little bit of work on that on Sunday, but we need to get back to that. I still need to finish, I guess, working through the Taylor Swift album. I mean, I guess technically I don't have to, but I need to. And we got to get back to systematic theology. Someone emailed me and wants me to, in 2026, to do a big series on what every Christian needs to know. And I'm like, well, oh man, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? And I think the problem is this, and hopefully this will make sense. I know I'm going to take a long time with this, but I hope it makes sense, because I want you to see the hermeneutical and interpretive problems that you can fall into when trying to do good Bible hermeneutics and good Bible interpretation. When you're really trying to respect the text, you find yourself sometimes in these, well, you're stuck and you're just, feels like you're spinning your wheels. So I haven't broadcasted. I don't know. I feel like, well, no, I didn't broadcast yesterday. Okay, I guess it was only one day. But I only did one broadcast on Sunday, and I was going to do another. So things haven't not quite worked out well. But it's because I'm stuck. So let me try to explain. In Ruth chapter 1, whether it intends to do this or not, it ultimately trains us. I guess that's the best way. It kind of trains us. It gives us a way of thinking. And it kind of gives us a way of thinking about how to read the book of Ruth in a very particular way. I know you don't necessarily think this, but this is kind of what happens. If you're really looking at the book of Ruth and you're reading chapter 1, it starts inevitably trying to convince you this is the way you're going to have to read the entire book. Because when you look at Ruth chapter 1, everything, I guess the only word I can use, it feels loaded. Places matter. Like anytime it names a place, it has great significance. Whenever it gives you the name of someone, it matters. When it gives these ironic situations, like there's irony, there's contrast. For example, Bethlehem is the house of bread with no bread. There's irony there. But see, when you see Bethlehem, it means the house of bread. Immediately you're like, wait a minute, the names mean something. We have a man by the name of Elimelech. His name means my God is king, but he's living in a time when there is no king in Israel, because it's the time of the judges, as Ruth chapter 1 verse 1 tells us. Naomi, her name means pleasure, pleasant, sweet. Well, it goes from pleasant to bitter. even the structure of the chapter, and in some ways, the way the chapter is putting together, it's doing theology. Even if you just contrast chapter 1 with the end of chapter 4. Chapter 1, verse 1, now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled. Well, what was when the problem in the days the judges ruled? Well, there was no king in Israel, and everyone was doing what is right in their own eyes. There is no king. Even though Elimelech's name is my God is king, there's a problem. But you end chapter 4, the end of the book with, and Solomon begat Boaz, Boaz begat Obed, Obed begat Jesse, and Jesse begat David. The last word of the book is, there is the king David. There is going to come, that in this book, we establish the lineage that will lead to David. And David, obviously, there will be a Davidic covenant made with him, which will ultimately lead to Christ, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. So you can't, it's impossible not to see all of these things. And let me make it very clear. The reason we see these things is because they're right there in the text. We're not importing them into the text. They arise from the text. So by the time you finish Ruth chapter 1, if you are a good Bible student and you're really paying attention to the text, you are conditioned to believe that everything in the book is going to work that way. So when you get to chapter 2, you're like, well, wait a minute. That name doesn't seem to do anything. Well, wait, that doesn't seem, well, wait, that doesn't, well, what's going on? Chapter 1, it was like one thing after another. You get to chapter 2 and you're kind of like, I'm a little confused. And so when you open up chapter 2, you're kind of like, okay, is there symbolism here? Is there a hidden meaning? What do the names represent? What does the field represent? What does gleaning represent? Wait, what does Boaz represent? You almost kind of find yourself right there. And I think that's where the problem really starts. And I think it shows up in so many sermons. Because I think if we're honest, and again, as a good Bible student, you're going to have to realize Ruth 2 does not feel like Ruth 1. And that's weird from a hermeneutical standpoint. The storytelling, in some ways, it slows down in this sense. It slows down because in Ruth 1, every word like, oh, wait, this word means this. This name means this. This means this. It feels like every single thing. In Ruth 2, it seems to, in some ways, it feels like it slows down. Maybe it feels that way. The narrator, or at least the text, see, in Ruth 1, the text kind of does the interpretation for you. All you have to do is look up the meaning of the names and you start seeing kind of a story unfold. But in chapter 2, it doesn't seem to do that. The chapter becomes very procedural. Here's the procedure, almost ordinary, almost mundane. And that kind of creates, at least for me, kind of this interpretive pressure. Like, wait, am I missing something? What's going on here? So now either we let the chapter do what the chapter is doing, or what we will do is we start supplying meaning into the text. And that's a problem. And that's what we have to be careful of. So that's why it's inevitable for someone to open up to Ruth chapter 2, and when it reads, Ruth chapter 2, verse 1, and Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a mighty man of wealth of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. That's why it's almost inevitable that the church is like, kinsman redeemer, Jesus, Boaz, Jesus. This is Jesus. And then they start interpreting everything in light of Jesus, the church, salvation, and they read it that way because chapter 1 almost builds this way of thinking. The only problem is you've got to hear this distinction. Chapter 1, we saw these things because they're explicitly right there in the text, right? You see Elimelech, all you got to do is look it up. My God is king. Naomi, pleasure, pleasant, sweet. It's right there in the text. Mahlon, Chilion, wasting away, death. You get the idea. Everything has these meanings and it tells a story, but it's right there in the text. You don't have to import it into the text. It's there. You just have to see it. Well, what happens when people get to kinsman, redeemer, and Boaz? The text doesn't say, this is Jesus, this is the Messiah. We read it into the text. And that's where the problem begins, all right? And we can't do that, all right? So think of it this way. And maybe this will help you. Ruth chapter 1 tells you to look carefully. Be very observant. Ruth chapter 2, in a sense, offers a test. Are you willing to look carefully, but stop where the text stops? Or are you going to start importing things into the text to carry on what you feel is a certain narrative? And I think this is important to try to understand, all right? Think of it this way. Not every single chapter, even within one book, communicates theology in the same way. Even when, yeah, I think that's the best way to put it. It's not always going. No matter what the theology is doing, no matter how it's presented, that it may not speak of that theology or give the theology in the exact same way. You have to let the text give you the theology, give you what it's giving you in the way it chooses to give it. You can't just impose, well, this chapter did it this way, this chapter has to. Now, I can understand. We have to at least always call into question when our approach changes. And I think a good way to understand Ruth 1 and Ruth 2, it's not that it necessarily changes. I think, that's a wrong way of implying it. It's just that it's not a change. It's a slowing down. It's like, okay, I've given you the framework. Now we'll take that framework and see how this applies it doesn't have to give us more stuff. It's just like, here's what I've already given you. Now, how does this play out in this historical narrative? If that makes sense. It's the same story. It's the same theology. Think of it as a different narrative volume. It's just a different narrative, a level or amount of, well, this represents this and this represents that. All right, let me try to say it a different way. After Ruth 1, the natural instinct is to treat Ruth chapter 2 in the exact same way. And so we start asking questions, right? Well, in Ruth chapter 2, what does the field represent? What does the field represent? What does Boaz represent? What does Ruth represent? What does gleaning represent? And I think before we even realize it, before we even know what we're doing, we're no longer reading the chapter, we're turning it all into a code. And that instinct doesn't necessarily come from the text. It comes from how chapter 1 trained us and how, most importantly, how sermons have trained us. Now, I want to make it very clear. There is no danger in noticing patterns. There's no danger in making observations that are in the text. The danger is supplying meaning that the text does not supply. We cannot read something in there that's not there. It has to arise from the text. So think of it this way. When the text explains, we interpret. When the text only describes, we simply observe. Right? And if you think about it in Ruth chapter 1, what is the text doing? In the days when the judges ruled. Oh, well, for crying out loud, that sets up so much. What's going on when the judges ruled? There's no king in Israel. Everyone's doing what is right in their own eyes. How does the book end? David. All right, so already that's setting up a framework, right? Naomi, not only does her name mean pleasure, pleasant, sweet, literally before you're done with chapter 1, she changes her name, signifying that the name has some great significance. We have famine. Where is the famine? In Bethlehem. What is Bethlehem? The house of bread. And in Judah. Well, wait a minute. That's the covenant land. That's the land of covenant. That's the land of promise. Why is there famine? Well, wait a minute. Famine is a curse if Israel's not faithful to their covenant. Okay, that's Deuteronomy 28 through 30. All right, so now we have Israel in their promised land, being in the land of promise, I should say, in the land of covenant, which is now experiencing the curses that come from not being faithful to the covenant. So this is Israel not being faithful to the covenant and suffering the consequences. But in Ruth chapter 2, I think that the chapter is not doing that, all of those things. It's taking all of that framework and it's talking about gleaning and dialogue and daily work. And there's not a lot of like commentary here. Right? So that is why I have been stuck. So this is what I've decided to do. I have to acknowledge there, and I don't like to say different, that there's just a different pacing. There's a different way of presenting it in chapter 2. But I feel then it's necessary to work through chapter 2. All right? I feel that there has to be. But that does not mean, let me make it very clear, even though chapter 2 is not loaded the way chapter 1 is, there is still a lot going on. And we're going to try our best to figure this out. But we're going to start in the slowest way possible, all right? Because what we're going to do, are you ready? We're going to start chapter 2 and we're going to basically focus on one word, one person. And it may feel like, well, this is very much like chapter 1. It is because it's going to set up the framework, but the rest of chapter 2 is not going to operate in this direct way. So there is still going to be this tension, all right? Okay, so are you ready? Here we go. If you have your Bible, we kind of just explained that there's a difference here, but we're going to start chapter 2 and we're not going to make it very far at all. I struggled on how to put this together, but I think this is very important, all right? When Ruth chapter 1 ends, it ends with a very emotional and theologically loaded scene. Maybe one of the most emotional and theologically loaded scenes in the book, all right? Look where Naomi is. Look at verse 19, Ruth chapter 1, verse 19. So they too, Ruth and Naomi and Ruth, went until they came to Bethlehem, and it came to pass when they were come to Bethlehem that all the city was moved about them, and they said, "Is this Naomi?" So you have them Bethlehem, the house of bread. They're going back to it, or Naomi's returning to it. Ruth is going to be arriving for the first time in a sense. And she came unto them. So here she is, this dramatic scene. She's in Bethlehem, and she says to them, "Call me not Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty hath dealt very bitterly with me." This is dramatic. This shows you the significance of the name, but the name now is being changed, right? She is standing in Bethlehem. And again, let me just state it again. She is telling them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty." All right? I don't know how, there's so much we could do right there. Just look, she literally says in verse 21, "I went out full, and the Lord hath brought me back home again empty." So much I could say right there, so much, right? But just keep this is emotionally, theologically powerful and significant. It's easy to read past it, right? It's easy. We want to get to Boaz. We want to get to Jesus, the church. Just slow down. We have to see what's going on here. Because in chapter 1, it has been about famine. It's been about exile. They leave the house of bread to go all the way down to Moab, right? There's death, there is loss, and then ultimately there is return. And it's all set. All of this happens explicitly in the days when the judges ruled. That's Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. So it already puts this entire story, it puts this entire narrative inside, I think it's easy to say, one of the darkest covenant periods in Israel's history. the period described at the end of the book of Judges, which Judges goes right into Ruth. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Or in his or her own eyes, or in their own eyes. You have to see that setting. If you remove Ruth from that setting, you destroy it. And everybody wants to remove it from that setting because they want to make it about us. They want to make it about the church. They wanted to make it about Jesus. They wanted to make it about soteriology. And that is a problem. Ruth 1, then, there's no question about it, feels heavy. It's supposed to. It feels theologically dense. There's no question that it is, because every word carries this meaning. Everything is loaded with meaning. It doesn't feel that way. It is. Again, Bethlehem, just go through all of them. Bethlehem, the house of bread. Elimelech, my God is king. All of that. Naomi, everything. And in some ways, the chapter ends, I guess, with a small glimmer of hope, right? So Naomi returned with Ruth, the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, which returned out of the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem in the beginning of barley harvest. There is a glimpse of hope at the end of chapter 1. So when you open up to Ruth chapter 2, I think there's kind of a natural expectation of how this is going to move forward. But the first thing we notice is it doesn't seem to move forward. It begins with, and Naomi. And Naomi. Some translations, now Naomi. The chapter, and so we're going to start working. This is as far as we're going to get, but I want you to just see this. I want you to feel how all of this fits together. The chapter, this is the thing, if you're just doing observational work, the chapter does not begin with Boaz, does not begin with Ruth. It begins with Naomi. You have to see that from a narrative perspective. And I think it should immediately stop you. It doesn't begin with Boaz walking into the field. It doesn't begin with Ruth going to glean. It doesn't begin with hope. It begins by anchoring us right back to Naomi. In a sense, this is her story, at least up to this point. If you think about it, Naomi, in many ways, is kind of the theological and maybe emotional center, especially of chapter 1. She is the one who loses her husband, right? Ruth chapter 1, verse 3. And Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons, right? She loses her husband. She loses her sons. Ruth chapter 1, verse 5. And Mahlon and Chilion died also, both of them, and the woman was left of her 2 sons and her husband. The text really emphasizes that. Naomi is the emotional center of the narrative. She loses her husband. She loses her sons. That's emotional. I know we can read it in the most academic, but feel the emotion here. This woman loses her husband and her sons. She is the one who goes away full but comes back empty. She is the one who changes her name, says, no longer call me Naomi, call me Mara, bitter. And then in chapter 2, we read, now Naomi. It basically is saying, hey, we're still in this story. Don't jump ahead. Don't stay in this story. Feel the weight of this story, the emotion, the situation. Remember Naomi. But here is, I think, a key element here. Why does it go back to Naomi? Why? Not only because it wants us to feel the weight of this is Naomi's story, but I think there's more to Naomi that maybe we need to see a little bit more, all right? See, Ruth chapter 1 doesn't just tell us Naomi is suffering, which it clearly does, as I've just demonstrated. It tells us, again, this is so critical, when this is happening. It is happening in the days when the judges ruled. Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. This is, put it this way. When Ruth chapter 1, verse 1 begins and the days that the judges ruled, that's not a neutral timestamp. It's not neutral. The book of Judges describes a repeated cycle. Israel sins, or you could say God blesses, Israel ultimately sins. God brings covenant discipline. Israel falls under oppression by foreign nations. Israel suffers. Israel cries out. God sends a deliverer. He blesses them. And then the pattern begins again. So God blesses. We see it. So God blesses. Israel sins. God brings covenant discipline. Israel falls under oppression by some foreign nation. Israel suffers. Israel cries out. God sends a deliverer. God blesses. Then Israel sins. God brings covenant discipline. It goes through this cycle over and over and over and over and over again. And you can see this. Israel under Moab, Judges chapter 3, verses 12 through 14. Wait, Moab? That's interesting, right? Because Ruth opens up where we're going to be introduced to a Moabitess, right? Israel under Midian, Judges chapter 6. Israel under the Philistines, Judges chapter 13. And this is exactly what God warned Israel about in Deuteronomy 28 through 30. Disobedience would bring famine. It would bring loss. It would bring suffering. It would bring displacement. It would bring distress. And we can look all of this up. We can look it up in Deuteronomy 28, 15 through 25, 38, Deuteronomy 28, 38 through 42, Deuteronomy 29, 22 through 28, and Deuteronomy 30 verses 1 through 3. You can look up all the references. Deuteronomy 28, 15 through 25, Deuteronomy 28, 38 through 42, Deuteronomy 29, 22 through 38, Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 1 through 3. We've already looked at them in a previous episode, so I'm not going to look at them again, but there is no question about it. Everything happening here is exactly what Deuteronomy said would happen if Israel wasn't faithful to their covenant. And we see that in the book of Judges over and over. God blesses them. They sin. Covenant discipline falls upon them. Then they suffer under some kind of oppression by some kind of foreign leader. They cry out to God. God delivers them. Boom. We have the same cycle. And Naomi's life, by no means am I saying her life is an allegory. Don't get me wrong. It's a historical narrative. She's a real person living within this situation, and her life fits, doesn't reflect, it fits the same covenant pattern. Famine drives the family out of the land. Why is there famine in the land? Because of covenantal unfaithfulness. Death empties her household. She returns with nothing. All right? And I think this is important. Naomi is not a symbol of Israel. She is literally an Israelite living inside Israel's covenant history. Her life is simply not symbolic. Her life is the life of Israel being lived, it's like, here's Israel, but we're going to step away from Israel as a nation because we've seen that play out over and over in Judges. Now we're going to zoom in on one person living within this situation. Her story is not allegory. It's covenant life on the ground. It's like, okay, hey, we've been talking about Israel. Look, but let's zoom in and let's focus on, there they are. Look at that family. And let's focus specifically on Naomi. And I don't think it's accidental that Naomi ends up in Moab. During the time of Judges, which sets up the entire framework, Israel repeatedly finds itself under the power or influence of pagan nations as covenant discipline. Moab itself was one of the oppressors earlier in the book of Judges. It's Judges chapter 3. Now notice, in Ruth 1, Naomi is not conquered, she's not enslaved, but she is outside the land among a pagan people because of covenant distress. Her personal story fits the same covenant world her nation is living in. It's not symbolism, it's shared history. I am not importing symbolism or allegory onto this. The text screams at me, time of the judges, time of the judges, time of the judges, time of the judges, time of the judges. And where we end chapter 1, Naomi is, Mara, bitter. I went out full. I came back empty. Come on. And then all of a sudden we open up chapter 2. Now Naomi. It's telling us, don't forget all of this. Don't forget this entire framework because it sets everything up. And maybe this is a big deal, maybe it's not. The text, just notice, doesn't call her Mara. Even though she said, call me Mara, the text doesn't. It says, and Naomi. It doesn't say Mara. It remains using her name, Naomi, right? Which I think is somewhat interesting, all right? She may feel bitter, and she probably does. She names herself bitter because she probably is, but the story doesn't rename her. And in some ways, I think the narrator's like, well, she went away. She went out full. She came back empty. She's bitter. Well, that's sad. All right, Ruth, you're next. No. It's not forgotten Naomi. All right. And I think her story is not done. All right. Now, this is important. Okay, listen again to how the verse begins. Now, Naomi, here's Naomi, right? She's living out, in a sense, in her own life, what Israel has gone through, right? Covenantal unfaithfulness, discipline, finding yourself under foreign rule, under the foreign influence, all of that, right? She finally comes back. There's at least some hope because now there's bread back in the house of bread. But notice, and Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a mighty man of wealth of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. Another translation, now Naomi had a relative of her husband's. This is not really, at this moment, it's not even redemption. It's not restoration. It's just like, wait, there's a kinsman. It now gives us a sense of possibility. She's still poor. She's still empty. She's still vulnerable. She's still without an heir. And in some way, she's still bitter. Nothing has changed. But the text is like, hey. There is a kinsman. There's a relative. In a sense, this is kind of classic storytelling. The story is telling us something before the character does. And Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a mighty man of wealth. Right? It's like the story steps in and goes, there's Naomi. Man, talk about a mess. Talk about bitter. Talk about suffering. Remember her story. Don't forget her story, because her story is the whole framework here, right? But there's a relative. There's a kinsman. And then we have him named. His name is Boaz. Now, Boaz here is not, he's introduced as a relative, not necessarily as a hero, not even really as a redeemer. He's just introduced as a relative of her husband, a mighty man, and wealthy. All right? That's how he's kind of named. Well, which gives you at least some sense of hope. He's mighty. That seems powerful. Wealthy. Well, that's good, considering she's empty, poor, and bitter. Okay, so it gives you some sense of hope. In some ways, though, Boaz is kind of framed by the problem, right? He's part of this broken household. He's at least a relative to this broken household. In a sense, when he first enters the story, there's a little sense of, oh, look, here he is. But he's also kind of a part of the mess as well, because he's a relative to these, broken people. And, a good portion of they're dead, so he kind of is a part of it. So Naomi's story fits into the same covenantal pattern of living during the time of the Judges. Again, Israel is the emphasis in Judges, but Naomi now becomes the living example of it in the life of one person. She doesn't symbolize Israel. In a sense, she is Israel. She is living this out. So don't think of it as typology. This is history, all right? Ruth chapter 2, verse 1 does not tell us that God has redeemed Naomi. It tells us, in a sense, that God has not abandoned Naomi. I haven't forgotten you, in a sense, right? And a roundabout way of saying, hey, here's Naomi. Remember how bad her story is? Had a kinsman of her husband's. Oh, Oh, wait. There's a sense of hope. There's a sense of hope. Even though her situation is hopeless and helpless, other than there being some bread in the house of bread, she has no protection. She has nothing. She has no heir. She has literally nothing or no one. She is in a hopeless, helpless situation. In fact, I like this. There's no miracle. There's no voice from heaven. It's just, there's a relative. There's a relative. There's a relative. Oh, it doesn't look like, wait a minute. No, I don't need a relative. I need you to part the Red Sea and drop manna from heaven. I need you to, I need a husband, or I need something here. And I think most sermons, when they turn to Ruth chapter 2, they want to get to Jesus, supposedly. That's what they want to get to. But the text starts with Naomi. She's still bitter. She's still empty. She's still in trouble. Think of it this way. Ruth chapter 2 is making sure we understand that this is not a fairy tale. This is not a romance. It's covenant history moving forward ever so quietly and ever so slowly. She's back. She's bitter. But hey, there's a relative. I cannot stress that enough. So at one level of the story, this is about Naomi, and of course, Ruth is going to be introduced here. We know Ruth is with her because at the end of chapter 1. They're two vulnerable women with no land, no heir, and no protection. Now, the law of God has made a provision, right? For people exactly in this situation. A kinsman could step in. A family member could act. A household could be preserved. But I don't think the book is letting us forget something bigger. From the very first verse, it has told us that this story is happening in the days of Judges. I cannot stress that enough, right? When there was no king in Israel. Cannot stress that enough. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. I cannot stress that enough. Naomi's suffering is not just personal, it's part of this larger covenantal story. So when the story enters the kinsman, after recentering, it's recentered us, there's Naomi, then it enters the kinsman. Okay, I cannot stress this enough. It's doing, really, in a sense, two things at one time. On the surface, it's telling us how this family story may get to move. Finally, Naomi's story may get to move forward. Finally, her and Ruth may get to move forward. But I think at the same time, it's doing something else. It's reminding us of something much larger, that this is about a people living in covenantal disorder. They do not just need better circumstances. They need something else. Israel needs more than just better circumstances. They need something deeper. They need something more than just better circumstances. They ultimately need redemption. Now, that redemption is not going to come quickly, right? It doesn't come loudly. And then right here, at least in this verse, it doesn't even show up immediately, right? Because especially for Israel, something has to happen that seems small and seems quiet, right? What do you need? Well, you're going to need ultimately Boaz and Ruth to have a son that ultimately is going to bring about the line that will give us David. See, the story is going to ultimately lead us to something, but in a much slower way. It's not going to be dramatic. It's going to be slow. It's not going to be immediate. It's going to be years down the road. And then once you get to David, you still have a long ways to go before you get to Jesus. It's a quiet moving forward. You could say this way: God has made a covenant with Israel. God is going to keep that covenant. And it's going to move slow. And we're going to see this. Naomi is living this story out in her real life. And ultimately, Or Naomi is living this story out in real life. Ruth is going to be a part of this story. We're ultimately going to get to David, which will ultimately get us to Christ, which will ultimately get us to, well, the one to redeem Israel. So think of it this way. Chapter 2, verse 1, and Naomi. All right, boom. That frames it right back into the right situation. All the horrible things that have happened, we're still in her story. Her story has two levels. Her story, but her story is the story of Israel. It's her story, but it's the story of Israel. Everything that's happened to her has been happening to Israel, and we see that in the book of Judges, which is the setting. Right now, here she is. Okay, what? Oh, there's a relative. It's the kinsman redeemer. Now, the kinsman redeemer is going to be the story of, well, how does this kinsman redeemer enter into the story of Naomi and Ruth? What does the kinsman redeemer supposed to do? How does he do it? How does this all play out? That's going to be a central part. And the rest of this, right? It's going to play a major part of this. But then ultimately, that's going to point us to, well, how God is the kinsman redeemer for Israel, right? He can redeem Israel as the kinsman redeemer because they are a relative to him as far as covenant is concerned. He refers to Israel as his firstborn son. He chose them. They are his people. And when we open up the New Testament and we see Jesus coming, he came to save his people from their sin, Israel. When you look at the New Covenant, it's made with whom? The house of Israel and the house of Judah. He can redeem them as a kinsman redeemer because he is relative. For us, he's not my kinsman redeemer because I'm a child of the devil. I am outside of the covenant. I'm a stranger. I'm an enemy. I'm by nature a child of wrath. God then saves me, adopts me into the family of God. I become a child of God through salvation. He's not redeeming a relative. He's redeeming an enemy. He's redeeming a stranger. He's redeeming a foreigner. Israel, he redeems them as the kinsman redeemer. But Naomi frames the whole story frames around her. Her entire life here has been basically the story of Israel in the book of Judges. But now that story is reduced to one person. And now the kinsman redeemer is introduced. And Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a mighty man of wealth of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. Oh, I hope that sets up everything. Now, I could have moved this in a much quicker way, but I want you to see how Naomi, the whole story is framed around her at this moment, right? So there's Naomi. All right, here's the kinsman. Now, once we understand everything about the kinsman redeemer, we will see how the kinsman redeemer works in her story, Ruth, and then we will see how it plays out to Israel. We've already done this a little bit in our episode on Boaz, but that you can't just, hey, Naomi, move on. No. Naomi is where you're like, oh, wait. That frames it. Everything fits together there. All right. All right. I hope that makes sense. All right. So we need to learn everything about the kinsman, everything about him himself, Boaz, about the kinsman redeemer's duties, responsibilities, what he does. And we've already done this a little bit. I know it'll be a little bit redundant, but we have to build it out. I wanted to fix the Boaz is Jesus nonsense and fix the kinsman redeemer being our redeemer nonsense because we have to place this into the covenantal context of Israel because that's what this is going to be referencing. But we'll have to see how this plays out for her and Ruth, and then how it fits, because she is living out Israel's history. She is the living example as an individual of what Israel had been going through the entire book of Judges. You have to see that. So then the kinsman is going to be for her story, but ultimately for the story of Israel. That you have to see how that plays out. All right, I'll stop right there. See, tires are still stuck. I did not get where I needed to go. I apologize, man. All right, well, I did what I did. I don't know what else to do. We'll try to get to another episode. I got to get out of this. I feel like I'm stuck. I feel like we should have moved on. But see, if I moved on, you see my struggle here? Like, I know you're going to say, well, that was a little too repetitive, but I had to establish the story. I can try to defend it, but on the other hand, I could have probably tried to do it quicker and then get right to the kinsman, but then I destroy the emotional center. The emotional center is Naomi, right? So I've got to frame it around Naomi. And if I just immediately jump to the kinsman, she'll get lost. But by spending all of this time on Naomi, I felt like then I broke the story up. I don't know. All right. Well, nothing I can do. I've done what I've done. We'll try to get to the next episode soon. Thanks for listening. God bless.